Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Catholic Studies and Lonergan Institute's Spring Lonergan Lecture. In just a few moments, we'll hear from Dr. Ann Carpenter, Associate Professor of Theology and Religious Studies at St. Mary's University in California. She's the author of the book Theopoetics, Hans Urs von Balthasar and the Risk of Art and Being, and also of the soon-to-be published Nothing Gained is Eternal, a Theology of Tradition. She's also the author of numerous scholarly articles and a number of my favorite articles in Church Life Journal. Dr. Carpenter's talk today is entitled God's Glory in Part Is You, Bernard Lonergan, Interiority, and Theological Aesthetics. The talk takes up a theme that is much discussed in various corners of our society and of our universities today, the theme of colonialism and its legacy. Colonialism is a signal example of what Lonergan calls decline. In the interpretation of history, as well as the interpretation of our own times, Lonergan suggests that there are always three cross pressures, three vectors pressing against one another. There is first progress, which is his term for the ongoing and good work of normal human people questioning, discovering, creating, healing, improving, and building. But the goodness and progress of human intelligence is too often matched and more often exceeded by the cross-pressure of decline, our human tendency, well attested to in history, but also in our own lives, of letting narrow, partial, and selfish goals direct our thoughts and actions instead of our reason. We may be insightful, brilliant even, but most often we are insightful and brilliant in ways that serve ourselves and our own communities, and least often in ways that serve others. The interplay of progress and decline create the ambiguities, the chiaroscuro, of any cultural moment, and certainly not least our own cultural moment. Yet for Lonergan, there remains a third cross pressure, which he calls redemption. And redemption for Lonergan is rooted not in human intelligence, nor in human selfishness, but in the transformative power of love to free us in ever greater degrees from our individual and collectively biased ways of thinking and selfish ways of acting. Love frees us to envision and enact new solutions. The reality of decline is all too evident, especially as our awareness has turned in recent weeks to the war in Ukraine, a place dear to members of our community here in Catholic Studies. So this talk and Lonergan's thought, unfortunately, remain timely. But they're not only that, they're an invitation in the first place to increase our attention, and then also our understanding, judgment, and decision in the pursuit of peace. Tomorrow, March 25th, is the Catholic Feast of the Annunciation, and Pope Francis has invited all Catholics, all faithful, especially Russia and Ukraine, to consecrate themselves to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. It's an odd word, consecrate, but really what it means is to set ourselves apart for peace. Peace modeled on a human heart, the heart of Mary, which according to Catholic theology is one of the few hearts that knew nothing of decline, but only of love. So I thought to begin in our own aspiration towards such a demeanor, perhaps we can take a moment of silence now to pray for peace. Having done that, I would now like to invite Dr. Ann Carpenter with a hearty round of applause and Seton Hall welcome.
Oh. I'll just point at you for the. All right, thank you for having me. Can you hear me okay? All right, I am a soft-spoken small person. All right. I realized then why you will always be a monster, Corey says to Bishon. near the end of Ram V's comic called These Savage Shores. Kori is a member of a small indigenous community in India. It is the 17th century. Colonial England lengthens its reach in India by the day. We, the reader, are here to witness a personal and a peopled tragedy made a metaphor. An English vampire, it's a comic book. English vampire has turned Kori into a vampire. Ishan, who loves Kori, who loves him, is not a vampire. He is something else. He is a Rakshasa, a human-like monster from Indian folklore that appears in Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism. And so here we are. These lovers are now both monsters. But Kori offers a crucial and tragic distinction, one that will ambiguously cleave their love forever. You were never made, Ishan. But I was made by the choices of monsters. In this claim, truth and metaphor breach one another, and a comic book's visual play with monstrous lore becomes a serious word of truth. That word of truth is the truth of the colonial endeavor. In it, persons radically and permanently remake persons, remaking themselves in the process. History, says Bernard Lonergan, is the making and unmaking of man by man. Thus is colonialism, whose making still makes us, whose making we still make, ratifying it, as it were, in our action, by which we are ambiguously remade. Okay, it is important to notice the asymmetry. One imposes on another. There is a maker and a made. That is the first consistent feature of the colony. It is important to notice the decisions, the making. Colonialism does not occur apart from human beings making decisions. Or to put it another way, the material object of human history is human action. This is what Lonergan said in the 1930s. So our object here today is fundamentally that of human action. For colonialism is a constantly transfiguring series of interpolating actions, which is its other major feature, that it requires persons acting, that it is achieved. Frantz Fanon assembles a conceptuality for something like Kori's distinction, so between never being made and being made, when he says, the Malagasy has ceased to exist. The reactions and the behavior patterns to which the arrival of the European in Madagascar gave rise were not tacked on to a pre-existing set. There was no addition to the earlier psychic whole. Colonization for Fanon is not an addition, but a transformation, a change, a making, wrought by persons making decisions. The Malagasy no longer exists. A colonized subjectivity, a new creation, neither an ex nihilo nor an addendum, so neither from nothing nor just an addition, now exists. In the concise language of these savage shores, nothing will ever be the same again. And that is my dilemma. What sense can be made of the making that colonialism makes? What sense can be discovered in the I was made of the human subjectivities wrought by colonial conquest? What sense can be discovered Oh, I read that one. How does Bernard Lonergan gesture toward this sense in me, the one who asks? Lonergan is the theologian of secret interior spaces, the immeasurable well of human interior being. I, and by that I mean the I of I and thou, the I before and in and beyond all speech, the that wakes when we wake. The strange mystery of you and me, a mystery that really is also secret in the sense of secerne. Oh, secondary. Sorry. Nervous now. All right. We set apart. There is in me a quality that is not yours. A quality that would go on unnamed if we reduced it to mere material separation, as if we were two chairs sitting next to each other. We are that, but also more. I say, I am not you and you are not me. I mean something more than that we're two chairs next to each other. I mean a something or other like self-presence, a self in its presence, a consciousness. And Lonergan is the theologian of this mystery and secret, of this peculiar feature of being human, of the being that he calls luminous. Conscious being, Lonergan explains, is not an object, not part of the spectacle that we contemplate, but the presence to himself of the spectator, contemplator, the prior presence that makes introspection possible. For Lonergan, then, consciousness is experience. It is that prior presence of self-presence, the that wakes when we wake. And if this is so, then this consciousness is not out there. It is not an object outside of me or outside of my being me, waiting for me to stare at it as if in a mirror. Nor is this consciousness a consciousness outside of history. There is not that pre-existing set that Fanon derides. But to say all this is a problem, or something like a terrible crisis. One as full of terror as full of crisis, since it makes the price of colonialism even more intimate, even more dear. It is the price of violences that ripple their way through consciousnesses in history. And human consciousness is, in a way I hope to explain a little, the central engine for this violence and for any possible escape from. And just FYI, I'm gonna a few times have something for you to look at that's sort of related, so that you're not always just staring at a quote for a few minutes. It's all from the same comic, These Savage Shores. Okay. All right. For Fanon, the work of colonialism bears in itself a double conceit, two lies, designed to conceal the basic violence of the colony. There's the conceit I've already named, that colonialism is a kind of addition to a whole, like it's on top. That a radical change in everyone has not occurred. That cultures and people touch one another like glass objects. Breakable, yes, but with clear boundaries. That's one lie. Then there is that conceit inversion. That colonialism adds nothing to the colonizer, who is, as it were, already and always whole. Already and always a European, right? A West. 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 But the reality is otherwise, and it is otherwise doubly. The feeling of inferiority of the colonized, Fanon explains, is the correlative to the Europeans' feeling of superiority. Let us have the courage to say it outright. It is the racist who creates his inferior. To understand that, let's step back again into the logic of these savage shores. I want to study a parallelism and a page. So first a parallelism in the story and then a page from the story. Okay, so the parallelism. The first words spoken in the story are Corit's. Bathed in sunlight, she asks, "Tell me again, how were you made, Bishan?" The question surfaces several times in the story, and Bishan answers differently every time. His replies review several major and often contrary features of the Rakshasa in their various mythological settings. They're always godlike or god adjacent, eternal. They commit violence, weltering in some midway between curse and life. They are cannibals of sorts, often having to do with blood. I find these multiple mutating beginnings significant in their own way. This is not an India with a seamless or whole beginning, a nascent coherence. India is not out there. In fact, there are factions among the various Indian characters in the story. The coherence of India as India, at least as we know it now, even as its people know themselves now, is itself a colonial product. For India to become India, again, as we know it, it first had to be, in Charles H. Long's loaded phrase, signified. So Bishan's multiple beginnings are significant inasmuch as they fray the idea of a single, seamless us. Since this us is, as the story will tell us, an us viscerally made by a British them. Not only does the storytelling defy the convention of the innocent native, but also it indicates a multiplicity that threatens to be flattened or collapsed when British action organizes the Indian people as a unit. The nearest equivalent to the Rakshasa has, in Western mythology, is our other major monster in the story, the vampire. The two monsters are paralleled more than once, with glowing eyes, with an ability to transform into far less human shapes. So they can be human-like, but they also go full monster. And they all have misbegotten destinies. But Bishan has a melancholy that the vampires lack, maybe even an ability to mourn at all, if mourning means something like accepting that beloved things someday die. And there is this further difference. These savage shores hooks together vampirism and colonial mercantilism so that the rapacious desire for blood and for gold are perplexed or sort of confused together. It is one of the story's many loud analogies, subtle as the sound of a car wreck. But loud analogies can be effective. I'm reminded of something Akile Mbembe says about the world today. There are no more workers as such. There are only laboring nomads. If yesterday's drama of the subject was exploitation by capital, the tragedy of the multitude today is that they are unable to be exploited at all. They're abandoned subjects, relegated to the role of a superfluous humanity. Capital hardly needs them anymore to function. Here I see that gold-blooded vampiric desire at a kind of apogee, one where it can no longer manage desire at all. It consumes itself, tasting its yearning over nothing, and we wither away wishing at least to be eaten. A nice, stable, paying full-time job would be a relief, wouldn't it? Or I guess you can be an unpaid intern. And thus our own desire is perplexed at itself, because I am desperate to be the unpaid intern or to have like a shitty but paying job, right? All right. So that's the parallelism. Rakshasa, vampires. Now to set up the page. Just before this page appears, set up for the page, Bishan has returned after a long and violent journey, and he sees Corey off screen or off the page, over elsewhere. We, the reader, only see him fall to his knees. And then we see this, the page. Here's the entire page as it appears on the comic. So when you turn your head, that's what you see. Let's read it for a moment. First, the 3 panels at the top. Next, yeah, good. See her eyes, glowing red, her pale face, the gold of her nose piercing, standing out. The next panel moves to her neck, 2 red bite marks, a fang in her mouth, glinting jewelry. Then her hand, the design of her tattoos bright against her pale skin, reaching down to Bishan's head. Come now, Bishan, she says. And then our eyes greet the final image, which takes up the 6 panels that are left on the 9-panel page. So it's a 9-panel grid, and you can split it up different ways that you want. So this is the larger image that takes up 6 panels. An image of Corey the vampire, fully unveiled. We look upward at her from below, as if brought to our knees. It is night. Corey is pale. Her eyes burn. She is a vampire. And she says, "Let me tell you how I was made." In Lonergan's way of speaking, sin is absurd. Sin is radically unintelligible. It has no reason to be done. Had it reason to be done, it would not be sin. On one level, a certain intending of some good of some kind occurs in the human action that we call sin, but not the necessary one. Not, that is, the good that is demanded by human reason. Put it another way, since we are speaking ultimately of the universe that God intends, and therefore of the order of the universe, do the good is to act in accordance with eternal law, which we know by a certain participation that is also autonomous. Participate in a way that can also decide about. Sin, Lonergan insists in grace and freedom, therefore must be understood as a withdrawal from the ordinance of the divine intellect. I do will a good of a kind, but not that particular good that accords with my reason, approximately, and with God's, primarily. When, then, says Lonergan, it is said that moral lapse is objective falsity, it is not implied that moral lapse is not objective. Obviously, it is objective. And so it admits the subjective truth to be found in empirical affirmations of existence and empirical classifications of its kinds. What objective falsity excludes is understanding. So again, there is no reason to sin and no reason in sin. What we are left with is the cold facticity of the absurd and of the patterns by which we surrender our reason freely. Writing in an American context, James Baldwin sees whiteness itself as a kind of making that always bears the shadow of what it conceals. Whiteness is a kind of objective falsity. Fundamentally, it conceals what some people do to other people, a doing that transforms these some and others into white and black. Notice decisions of temporality and responsibility, for example, in this explanation from Baldwin's On Being White and Other Lies. America became white. The people who, as they claim, settled the country became white because of the necessity of denying the Black presence and justifying the Black subjugation. Whiteness, for Baldwin, is not an out there now, a thing in itself. It is first of all a form of relating. And by relating, he doesn't mean the inmost thoughts of human beings, though we do carry those everywhere. He means something like Lonergan's good of order, not that racism are good or orderly, but that there's a setup, series of relating operations operated by persons in which goods probabilistically recur. And for Lonergan, we can ask whether a good of order is itself good. We can ask the question of value. This is, I think, resonant with what Baldwin asks about. And in his asking, he reveals a good of order, twisted up with, even ordered toward and around, an order structured by profound asymmetrical injustices. As they think they are white, they do not dare confront the ravage and the lie of their history. Because they think they are white, they cannot allow themselves to be tormented by the suspicion that all men are brothers. The sense and the nonsense are all tangled up together. In something like this logic, Mbembe calls that which is racial phantasmagorical. Not only is there this phantasmic production, schizophrenic ecstasy where supposedly race explains itself. So the phantasm is that color of skin explains what's happening when what people are doing explains what's happening. So it pulls away from what's actually real to the phantasm or image. Okay. Its production is also how. It is that, the constituting and mediating world of meaning that once existed in Europe, as much as in the world, have been permanently ruptured and changed. There is something colossal, says Mbembe, unaccountable and almost priceless that has been lost for good, and that is attested by the life of all our objects in captivity, just as that of all those of ours inside the carceral landscape of yesterday and of today. All of which is very sad to say, I know. I've made you sad, probably. These Savage Shores is a sad story too, though also beautiful. But I'm aware that it can strain our patience to review what we must also mourn. But I think mourning is very Christian. Here's our gift. Here's our the desperate arrival of needfulness, of needing to be different, of being overwhelmed by our inability to be different. The welling up of the only kind of human poverty that we can call sacred, since its needfulness is a needfulness that needs God. In this, I think often of Lonergan's insistence that sin as surd makes situations that are absurd, makes this impossible blend of sense and nonsense that we are forever tempted to break into smaller pieces, as if that would make them manageable. Or like doing chores instead of homework. The radical inoperability of sinful situations, that venerable Christian idea, threatens to overwhelm us with our futility. I can't take back colonialism. And objective falsity makes making sense of the selves that we are very hard. Since the material for ourselves is, well, the sense and the nonsense, the situation. In a world of meaning and in a good of order bent out of shape, I am, as a self, also bent out of shape, even before we get to notions like concupiscence. The choices that I am faced with will be bent out of shape. Sort of like tenured and tenure track faculty and adjuncts having resentment for one another when they're both being oppressed by administrations. Like no matter what decision you make, you are making a bad decision. I'm a little monstrous in my being myself, as major unauthenticity presses down with its weight. That which made me, and that I also make mine. I'm not a pure passive instrument. There's a moment in these savage shores when Bishan and Corey are on their way to London for the final boss battle. They're facing the big bad Count Dude, vampire guy, who turned Corey in order to hurt Bishan. She explains that she and the final boss vampire will be forever bonded by her being turned. And he did this deliberately so that she would always be able to find him. It is a version of W.E.B. Du Bois's double consciousness, where the racialized self is at once struggling for authenticity, struggling to be itself, and aware of itself according to another awareness, an awareness of itself as negated, a kind of negation appropriated from the moment this consciousness woke to the world of meaning. Du Bois kind of summarizes it with, he imagines a conversation between himself and a white colleague, because he's a professor, and the white colleague says to him, "How does it feel to be a problem?" Selves, but also one, a consciousness doubled within itself. In America, says James Baldwin, the color of my skin stood between myself and me. And for Baldwin, this truth is no less true for white Americans, even if it's differently true, since the situation imparts its fundamental asymmetry, which we ratify by our action. The trouble for our time, is gaining the measure of the world now made, that we now make. It's our world now. There is, I fear, no going backward. And worse, we are not keen on or good at change for the future. There are those knives for words dropped nonchalantly in method. Continuous growth seems to be rare. At me next time. But perhaps we can also discover a kind of hope. That unsealing times past is impossible. That I'll not find that gem of purity in the stone layers of history, the sharp shape which, shining, would explain my own being to me in a way that I can tolerate without guilt. Oh, my hope would have to be divine. It would have to be supernatural, since my own power is unmoored by an infinite responsibility for an infinite guilt. And this divine hope would need to face my own ambiguity. And in this hope, I could know the strange perplexity of sin and of the divine, super intelligible reply to it. We have then a problem. It is the problem of human history and its grandeur and misery. We have the problem of colonialism today. I've described aspects of this problem. Now it's time for my concluding arc, whose task is to offer a certain divine hope. My argument is this, that the problem of a colonial world is, at least partly, something analogous to the problem posed in Lonergan's opening to Insight, the problem of an invitation to action. More than all else, this is long, more than all else, he says, the aim of the book is an invitation to a personal, decisive act. But the very nature of the act demands that it be understood in itself and in its implications. What on earth is meant by rational self-consciousness? What is meant by inviting it to take possession of itself? Why is such self-possession said to be decisive and momentous? The questions are perfectly legitimate. The answer cannot be brief. And no kidding, it cannot be brief. Insight is more than 700 pages long. So here we are. How an account of knowledge, which Insight is, can be an invitation to a personal decisive act, which Insight also is, and which together is the whole mystery and trouble of Insight summarized. So there I said in the sentence what the problem was, even though the answer is hundreds of pages. Explaining how this, Lonergan's trouble, relates to this other problem that I've been discussing is my final intention. The trouble of being human is that human being is difficult to know in its being, and not difficult in the sense of a difficult arithmetic problem, but difficult in the sense that this being is polymorphic and evinced of a curvatus that suffers a fundamental unwillingness to know itself at all. Against the self-affirmation of a consciousness that at once is empirical, intellectual, and rational, says Lonergan, there stands the native bewilderment of the existential subject. It is a bewilderment of many kinds, since our composition as individuals is itself composite, a composition, a dynamic unity. We are to affirm ourselves as empirical, intellectual, rational. That is the task, Lonergan says, and it immediately threatens to be impossible. But for Lonergan, affirm ourselves we must in our complexity, which is to say, appropriate ourselves we must, or the struggle of our struggling is lost. To affirm oneself as a creature that attends, understands, reasons, decides, is not the same as knowing the contents of a book, even a 700-page book. Or rather, it is like that knowing if we know that the knowing to be had is in the mind that affirms, in that very act of affirmation. Books do not know things, but humans do. Put it another way, my students often use language of affirmation. I always think of as very Bay Area. Affirm me, affirm you. They want me to affirm them, which I'd also like to do. What we mean when we mean this is something like consciousness as objectified, and also something like being in its value or as valuable. But it always means something expressed, a bit like a child holding out a handmade gift or a discovery for approval. We might even think of self-affirmation this way. I hold myself out before myself, and I take the measure of me. Our conscience does something like this. When I say, oh, that was bad what I did, or should I do this? But this is not the affirmation that Lonergan means. People cannot be studied from a distance, says Baldwin. It is perfectly possible that we cannot be studied at all. God's anguish, perhaps, upon being confronted with his creation. People certainly cannot be studied from a safe distance, or from the distance which we call safety. And then, in that beautiful and daring way he has, he places upon his reader a burden, a responsibility that involves, among other things, a confrontation with oneself. No one is or can be the other. There is nothing in the other from the depths to the height, which is not to be found in me. Think of an athlete, dancer, someone whose movement is precision, grace, strength. Imagine how this person knows the length of their reach down to their fingertips, knows how deeply they can bend with each hinge of each limb, and knows what those limbs can hold and for how long. Now imagine that they know not only this leap or that stride in its performance, in its acting, but also imagine that they know what the operations are, the actions as they act. That their arm, for example, has for its hinges joints that are not all the same: wrist, elbow, shoulder. Each functions differently in the act of reaching. And I know this in its difference and in its operation. I can chain them together to render a movement that is more than each individual turn. My arm, and it's more than the sum of these different parts. Well, for Lonergan, human consciousness is something like this, but more radically. The operations do not resemble one another at all. And the only thing that holds the parts together isn't a thing at all. It is the elan that spontaneously organizes and rises through them. My consciousness that, wakeful, asks questions. I just love that page. Wanted you to see it. The more I affirm this, myself as luminous, the more this appropriation becomes also a kind of creation. Since my confrontation with me leads me into a vast new world of what Lonergan calls exigencies, or necessities, or bequests. The more I rise to this need built in me, which I need by also being, then will this need ask ever more fiercely that I continually become, that I make to be that making that I make in me, in all of my acting. Which is to say, the more I then am me. The more that I know me in the essential activities that make me, the more do I rise to what Hans von Balthasar calls the ought, that resides in the hero's heart. And it is a terrible and wonderful thing to ask, to discover, and to be, since it will ask me to confront my inattention, my irresponsibility, since it will ask me from within, as me, fall in love with God, since I will ask me, fall in love with God, and with the universe that God has made. The appropriation of such a self would be crucial, I must stress, for at least a moment, in the lives of racialized persons in particular, since the point of racial asymmetry is to negate their subjectivity, small and large ways. The point I'm trying to make is a point had only if you yourself have it, if you conceive yourself, that is, to affirm yourself to be this polymorphism by way of knowing yourself as such, an achievement that will require becoming aware of the operations as you yourself spontaneously operate them. It is a strange thing that I'm trying to say, since it seems so self-involved. It is so irrepressibly hinged on everything that I can't have done for you, and that I myself can only be to you as a kind of testimony, inasmuch as I do it too. But I do not think Lonergan is concerned with individuals as such, not if what he says is true. If self-appropriation is real, then it is not about the self merely, but about our responsibility before one another. So if we sense that something must be done about the tragedy of our present situation, then Lonergan tells us that we must ask with a kind of ascetic repetition about the ones who know and who act. Human authenticity is never some pure and secure, serene possession. Lonergan explains it is ever a withdrawal from unauthenticity, and every successful withdrawal only brings to light the need for still further withdrawals. Sort of like, oh, this is racist too, right? Continually more things to withdraw from. If colonialism imbricates us of an impossible asymmetry that also binds us to one another, if we share a monstrousness but unevenly, as makers and as made, then the way out is neither an act of forgetting, as if this did not happen to us, blank, start over from our memory. Don't worry, it never happened, just forget it. Nor is the way out an entirely new plan for a new humanity, as if we could empty the machine of its programming and start again. Alas, we're stuck with us. It has to be a discovery of the assembly that we are, in its spontaneity and its polyphony. I do not mean that we are, each of us, unique, though yes, we are unique. I mean the polyphony of operations that we spontaneously are and that we share. Those bare tools narrower than human limbs, those much more easily broken operations, consciousness. These must be the operations by which we who die might live. Baldwin's odd way of saying it really is the only way to say it, however mysterious. There is nothing in the other from the depths to the heights, which is not to be found in me. Baldwin suggests, I think, less a leveling. So he's not saying, I see no race, I'm magically reset as a person. It's more of a heightening in the way Lonergan might use the word. Final closing thought. Return to a subterranean theme. Balthazar, that guy I mentioned, has this phrase that he uses when he tries to describe a beauty that could affirm the downright ugly. Affirm it, he says, unsweetened. It would take, I think, a kind of grace to affirm the facts of an ugly history and to say that God intends for this history something beautiful. To say that this history, our actual history, this one, this world, not another timeline. This history is, and it is God's. But here mundane beauty, as Balthazar might call it, fails. It cannot manage this affirmation except in fragments. It bears up the contrary features of the grotesque. So God would have to affirm such a history and show us its intention. But he would have to do so in our language, is mundane. But this divine will and its truth for the world would not be mundane, since they're divine. It would be what Balthazar calls simply glory. It would be that beauty that really could embrace the ugly facts of our history to the very end, and at that end burst the doors of speechless death with a living spirit. The confession of human history in the triune God's confession of himself. Divine confession from a personal God, which means that it is also a personal address, or, to repurpose Lonergan, an invitation to a personal decisive act. Should totally read that comic book. It's awesome. I think it's from Lonergan's Method.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
Unauthenticity, yeah, it's ever a withdrawal. Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Each new withdrawal brings another one. Is that
Yeah,
that part?
Why is that the case?
Yeah. So, I don't know. I think he means something like when I think of nonsense I pull, for example, I'm not sure if you have a contrarian impulse, but I do. It causes me an immense amount of trouble. If everyone agrees, just watch me like disagree. Magic, just magically. And the second I realized that I need to not do that so much because I might not be responding to what's actually the case. I might just be resisting because that's what I'm used to. Second, I realized there's a whole series of other things that I also do that are related to that other thing that I was doing. So, for example, I can, my sister talk about this. I can get very stuck on an idea, and she said it's very clear when you're still thinking about an idea and not listening to the person anymore. And so I have to work on that. Lonergan means those kinds of things, but at an individual level and a macro level. So the more you step away from the problematic response, the more problematic responses arise as you try to replace it with good behavior. That makes sense. Yeah, and realizing that I'm not gonna like get out of problems like walking from one room to another. You know, sort of like when the first thing out of people's mouths is, I'm not a racist. It's like, well, given the world as it is, that would be hard. Right? You're a miracle, right? You are the second immaculate conception. Yeah. I don't know who says that either, but yeah, I think so. Mhm.
Step out.
Right,
Right.
right, right. Yeah, it's not suddenly over, right? And particularly because there's not a corresponding reparation, right? So in America, for example, the federal government, for a while, sort of window of time, started putting structures in place to transition the slave population to a new way of life, and then just ditched them, like gave up. And then, like, so that's leave sort of abandoning people in an incredibly difficult situation, right? Or Haiti's debt to France, which is insane. You owe us. I'm so impressed. Yeah.
More
Mm-mm. No, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I referenced the gift of tears, which medieval monks talked about a lot. Gift of tears when you're sorry for your sins. They were cool with crying, by the way. Thomas Aquinas apparently cried before every mass. Anyways, yeah, and it's a gift because it's the first step toward reform. And so that's the sign that the tears are from God, because that's the next step. Otherwise, it's sort of fake tear from me. I'm sad that the good of order favors me as a white person. Like that's still intellectual and not like a conversion to a new good that has to be done. I like where you're going, but yeah. Mhm. Yeah.
Question. I'm just going to ask to use this because they are very interested in this conversation. It's going to put
Oh
this.
my God, there are people online. Community of Saints, yes, watching. Feeling.
I'd like to follow up that engaging presentation about a comic book with a boring question about intellectual sources. And so I don't think it's super controversial to say that Lonergan isn't the most obvious conversation partner for figures like Fanon and Baldwin. And so I'm interested to hear what kind of inspired this dialogue. And I mean, is it is there a shared kind of intellectual family tree that they can all hang on? Are you kind of grafting Lonergan onto Fanon? Is it just that you like Lonergan, which is also an okay answer? But I'd be here why you think Lonergan is a good conversation partner for these discussions and these figures.
Yeah, so I referenced, at one point I referenced how we're stuck with ourselves. I'm a Lonerganian, first, who I am. And I'm learning about these questions. I have to use the furniture in my head. So there's not a family tree, there's just me reaching for sources. I am worried about us. So it's not, I don't have a fancy answer for you that like solves the problem of intellectual patrimony. I'm just stuck as me, right? As white Canadian dude, I like him. I hope that helps. It's very important. I just,
No, I'm sympathetic. I wrote a paper a year ago and someone asked me why I was using Grauner, and I said, I really like him. I think he's helpful. So, yeah. Thanks.
I mean, I think our history is our history. I'm not gonna be able to find a pure source, especially as me.
There are a few online questions too. I'm going to start with the first one. Eric Marby was asking, I was thinking about your penultimate quote from Baldwin and the relation to your incarnational conclusion. What implications do you see for the patristic notion of the admirable commerce? Yes, you got that. When we think about the application of Baldwin's self/other statement, to the incarnation. And then he continues to say, if everything that is the other is also in me, then that suggests that when the Son became incarnate, that everything in us is also in him. That was a lot.
Yeah, I don't know what the question is. I feel like Eric.
So what are the implications do
What
you
are the
see, I
implications?
think?
So, yeah, I mean, I'm running an analogy, so bear that in mind. There's a sort of different situation. But for Baldwin in particular, one of his concerns is so in America, the conceit, Europe does this too, but it faces it differently. The conceit is a split of people, and to sort of give goods differently to those people. So it's a concrete form of relating. That's concealed, particularly for white people. He calls it like a damning innocence. I have no clue. And so he not only points out the inequity, but like demands the first fracturing of the seamless system by suggesting that there is something that white Americans can learn from Black Americans, and it will help them to arrive at their own humanity. And I think analogously, Bryce does very similar, in as much as he is us, shows us ourselves. It's an analogy, though. No, Eric. That okay.
I'll ask a question.
Okay.
We talked about comics.
What about comics?
I'm just curious, and I know you teach a class using them too, more than one. So I'm curious about the sort of way that fantasy can sort of bring us to contact with truths, maybe especially truths that are difficult to either understand, hear, or consider. And if you found that, like, is that part of the effectiveness of this, or is there some other aesthetic reason for unpacking some of these themes in conversation that other forms of discourse?
Yeah, so I think stories do a couple things. One is, I mean, as images, beautiful images, they sort of catch hold of intellect and will. I want to give myself to the story, like, ooh, cool, monster. What is this about? Tell me more. And so I'm readier to teach. But Toni Morrison talks a lot about the relationship of her fiction to memory as a Black person with as an African American with like a lot of vanished history. And so for her, fiction is a form of remembering because it can speak truth where there's only just unintelligible facts to try and make sense of. So you're saying truth instead. So basically, I think what she's doing there, she's organizing what's absurd to say something more, which is impossible to do other than through fiction, I think, because like when I assigned a paper my students had to do on a bunch of 19th century African American sources, and what I learned from grading those papers is when they give me generalities about Jesus, I'm used to that, and only I'm offended, and only I care, like, about getting Athanasius wrong. But getting Nat Turner wrong is like saying to me a generality instead of the fact is the only thing we have is the fact, not, and so, yeah, sorry, I had a student say, and then Nat Turner kept on struggling for justice, and I wrote on the paper, he was executed. So like, do you see how getting the fact wrong, because we need the fact, actually is worse. And what do you do with that situation absurd, except to try and say the truth of who you are with an act of fiction? So yeah, I think stories can sort of like make of history a moral request instead of a brutal series of lacerations. Okay, bring it.
So Eric also had another question. He said, do you think such an application extends beyond merely the exchange between sin and righteousness, but between human and divine goods?
Probably, I think probably. I mean, even at a practical level, the kind of self-sacrificing charity required of us to, in fact, respond to the colonial situation is divine. Yeah. I think so. But I don't know. I am pro-God, so I might be fooled by the question.
A question from another Eric Eklund. He said, so monsters are made, Frankenstein's monster, for example, yet the making of the monster makes for the revelation of the brutality of colonization. I guess I'm curious about how you see the interplay between the violence of colonization as a creation of the monster, which its adverse movement that the monstrous gaze itself is a gift which exposes such violence for what it is. I guess my question revolves around, are monsters awkwardly necessary, or must we subvert the moral negativity of the phrase the monstrous?
I don't know. I don't know. I think monsters refer to where meaning breaks down. Yeah, where the meaningful no longer works to describe reality. So Mbembe is phantasmagorical. It's sort of the monstrous. And so on the one hand, it's necessary to see, okay, well, as a human being, I'm made into a series of contradictions, but I think it becomes gift with the grace of change. I don't want to say it's a gift in itself. Sort of like St. Paul. Should we then sin more? By no means. No.
Okay, there was less of a question, more of a comment. Bill Benzik wanted to say that he has been on Zoom groups engaged in dialogue to be sent in as a lay input on Pope Francis' synod for synodality.
Synodality.
Yes.
The new word.
I am struck by the brute fact that Roman Catholic history colonialism has been unmasked by this lecture. I invite radical comment about this. So I think that was like a little thank you. And Lisa Rose Wiles responded to his point. I'm pleasantly surprised that you refer to the culpability of my British ancestors in the creation of racial and political surds. To focus on American racism, while clearly problematic, tends to obscure this. Also loved the vampire book analysis. This could be extended to emotional vampirism.
Yeah. Yes. Traveling to different versions of colonialism is tricky. Yeah, I'd probably critique me too. Well said. Okay. Yes.
I was wondering, I kind of noticed a mirror almost between how you described colonialism as not something completely new, but not, it's like the way we make colonialism, and then also how we change, inward looking, how we change ourselves. And I was wondering if that was like intentional.
Yeah, 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 I think I don't mean that race and racism are primarily thoughts and feelings, but their engine remains human beings, right? So like, yes, our laws are applied racistly, and who's doing that? It's people, right? It's the police officers as much as the law. And so that the concrete hook there is important to me. So I was trying to pull those together without collapsing them. Hopefully effectively, but it's tricky.
One final question. A number of us in your class together on friendship.
Friendship.
Philosophical and theological theme or category, and I'm wondering, it seems like that's not unrelated to your talk. So how might thick forms of friendship be ways of beginning to move from inauthenticity? What role do other people play?
I mean, the only reason I got into reading about this stuff is because of my friend Joe Drexler-Dreiss. I just liked him. He was wonderful. And I said, I would like to be like you. Give me books to read. And he did. And so, yeah. I think the testimony of others.
All right, thank you very much.
Can I go away? Oh. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you all so much for coming. That is the end of our talk. We'll see you at our next event. Have a good night.
Makes it really